She had always been careful, cautious in the way most young women are, aware of the world's dangers, but determined not to let fear dictate her life. Her laughter was easy, her smile genuine, but underneath it all, there was a quiet vigilance. She knew how to watch for signs, to read a room, to trust instincts that often went unspoken. That night, she felt like any other. She was stepping out into the world with a sense of normalcy, expecting the familiar rhythm of friends and routine. She never imagined the night would twist into something unrecognizable, something that would mark the end of an innocence she had once taken for granted. It started subtly, the feeling that something was off. At first, it was just a glance too long, a presence too close, whispers that made her skin prickle. She brushed it off, telling herself she was imagining it, that she was overreacting. People often dismiss their instincts, thinking their intuition is paranoia. But her instincts were sharp, they had always been her guide. And yet, even the strongest instincts can only warn you. They cannot stop what happens when the world's cruelty decides to close in. When they arrived, she realized she was no longer just facing discomfort. She was facing deliberate intent, a calculated, predatory focus aimed at taking what belonged only to her. The weight of the situation hit her in a way that words rarely capture. She understood, in that split second, that her life had shifted irrevocably. It wasn't about one cruel act alone. It was about the knowledge that her safety, her trust, her very essence, could be violated by people who saw her as an object rather than a human being. She felt a surge of fear so sharp it was almost physical, a cold knot in her stomach that tightened with every second, with every movement they made around her. The world seemed to narrow into that small, terrifying space where she was trapped between what could be and what might be forced upon her. It wasn't just the fear of immediate danger. It was the understanding that this was a moment that would define her life if she let it. The innocence she had carried, the sense of safety she had once felt in her own skin, the simple confidence of knowing she could walk into a room and be just herself. All of that was threatened. She could feel the lines of childhood blurring, the fragile barrier between who she was and who she might be forced to become. Her mind raced, jumping from thoughts of escape to the overwhelming pressure of uncertainty. Every instinct screamed at her to move, to fight, to resist, but she also knew the precariousness of acting too soon. Predators rely on hesitation, on underestimating their target, and in that calculation, she saw the cruel logic of their intent. This was a test of control, a struggle not just of strength but of dominance and fear. She felt the weight of her own vulnerability pressing against her, but underneath it, something else began to stir, a quiet, stubborn awareness that even in the face of fear, she was still herself. Her spirit, though shaken, was not yet broken. In that moment, the realization came that she could never go back to the same way of being. The experience, even in its anticipation, had marked her. She was being forced into an awareness that was both terrifying and clarifying. The world could be brutal, people could be cruel, and innocence was fragile. That fragility, however, also carried with it the seed of resilience. To be a girl was to inhabit a space of untested trust, a vulnerability that the world could exploit. To lose that, to have the world impose its harshness upon her, was a transition she had not chosen, a moment where childhood ended not with ceremony, but with confrontation. Even as fear and uncertainty pressed down, she felt an emerging clarity. She recognized, in that small but undeniable way, that this was a turning point. The experiences of that night, the tension and danger, were stripping away a layer of naivety she had carried, leaving a core awareness of the stakes of the world. She understood, viscerally, that she was entering a new phase of life, not by choice, not gently, but with the force of reality pressing in on her. The weight of that realization, of knowing that her innocence was no longer intact in the eyes of the world, settled over her like a shadow, heavy but undeniable. They had come with a confidence that was chilling in its casual cruelty, a sense of entitlement that made the air around them heavy. It wasn't just their presence. It was the way they moved, the way their eyes roamed over the room as if ownership was their birthright. They underestimated her, and in that underestimation lay their arrogance, the very flaw that made them vulnerable to consequences they could never have imagined. They saw her hesitation, her careful, cautious movements, and they mistook it for weakness. They assumed that a young woman alone, aware but unarmed, would be an easy target. They were wrong, though they didn't realize it yet, and that error would define the rest of the night. Predators often operate on patterns, relying on predictable reactions, assuming that fear will always produce submission. They counted on her silence, on the social pressure, on the isolation of the moment. They counted on the idea that someone alone cannot fight back against the audacity of their lust. But she was not naive. She knew the dynamics of danger. She had studied them in stories, in news, in warnings whispered by parents and friends alike. And in the pit of her stomach, the part of her mind that always paid attention, she felt the outlines of their plan before it fully formed. Their underestimation was their mistake, and she clung to that knowledge like a lifeline. Her heart pounded, the rhythm echoing the tension that stretched across the room. They closed the distance, their intentions clear, and yet in their boldness, they exposed themselves. There was a recklessness in the way they approached her, a disregard for any consequences outside of what they thought they could control. They assumed she was alone, that no one was watching, that no one could intervene. In their arrogance, they missed the subtle signs of resistance in her posture, the sharp intelligence in her gaze. She was aware, calculating, feeling each moment stretch as she measured her options. Their confidence made them careless, and that carelessness was the first crack in their plan. They underestimated the fact that the world is rarely as simple as it appears in their own imaginations. Life has a way of intervening in the assumptions of the arrogant. They did not account for the unforeseen, the unpredictable, the element of someone else stepping in, someone who would not tolerate the violation they intended. And even more, they did not account for the quiet resilience in their target. Their prey was not passive. She was observing, learning, noting, absorbing every motion, every word, every shift in their energy. Their hubris blinded them to the simple truth that in their rush to dominate, they were exposing themselves to forces beyond their control. It was in that miscalculation that the dynamic began to shift, even before any direct action could take place. They were counting on fear, but what they did not see was the flicker of determination, the subtle but unyielding refusal to submit entirely. Their plan was fragile because it depended on total compliance, and compliance was something she could never offer. They assumed she was powerless, that her body defined her strength, that youth and inexperience were liabilities to exploit. They did not know that awareness, courage, and the capacity to hold space in moments of terror could outweigh any perceived advantage. The tension built, thick and suffocating, as they made their moves with a casual confidence that only served to highlight their misjudgment. Every step they took was a gamble, every gesture a demonstration of arrogance, and yet each one pushed them closer to a point where consequences would be unavoidable. They underestimated not only her awareness but the network of circumstances surrounding her. They assumed isolation, but the world rarely works entirely in their favor. Even in the smallest, subtlest way, forces beyond their reckoning were converging, and their lack of foresight would soon become their undoing. She felt the weight of their assumptions pressing against her, trying to box her into a corner, to reduce her to something less than herself. And yet, within that pressure, a strange clarity emerged. Their underestimation was not just a danger, it was an opportunity. In their arrogance, they had revealed themselves, exposed their methods, and unknowingly provided the leverage that would alter the course of the night. Their lust, their sense of entitlement, their certainty in their own dominance, all of it became a weakness they could not see. The more they assumed she was powerless, the more reality moved against them in ways they could not anticipate. Even as fear surged through her, it was tempered by the understanding that their assumptions were faulty. They believed in a narrative that suited them, a story in which their intentions would go unchallenged. They assumed control would be easy, submission inevitable. But the world, the circumstances, and her own presence as a conscious, aware individual disrupted that narrative. Their underestimation, that single fatal flaw, would become the hinge upon which the night turned, even as they remained blind to it, convinced that everything was still in their favor. Then he appeared, not like a hero from a storybook, not like someone called in at the last moment, but like a force that had always been quietly present, waiting for the moment to intervene. The Navy SEAL's presence was unmistakable, even in the shadows. There was a weight to him, a silent authority that made the air itself tense, a presence that seemed to reshape the room without a single word. He didn't rush in with theatrics or bravado. Instead, he moved with precision, every step deliberate, every glance calculated, aware of the stakes and the dangers that could erupt in an instant. There was no hesitation, no doubt, only a controlled readiness that marked him as someone who had faced far greater threats and emerged unshaken. He noticed the subtle details first, the shift in her posture, the tension in the room, the predatory intent in the eyes of those who thought they had the advantage. To anyone else, the scene might have seemed chaotic or unclear, but to him, the dynamics were obvious. He could read the danger before it fully manifested, anticipate the movements of those who underestimated the world around them. His training had honed him to observe, to assess, to act with exact timing. But it was more than training. It was instinct refined by experience, by countless hours of confronting threats where hesitation could mean disaster. He understood that a predator's confidence was often its own undoing, that arrogance could be leveraged against those who thought they were untouchable. As he approached, the energy in the room shifted. The air, once heavy with tension and fear, now carried a subtle, almost imperceptible edge. The would-be attackers did not see him immediately. Their focus was on what they thought was their victim, on the assumption that no one would intervene. But he moved with the quiet inevitability of someone who knew precisely what needed to happen. There was a sense of inevitability in his steps, a calm precision that contrasted sharply with the chaos they were trying to impose. They were about to encounter a force they had not anticipated, one that was not reactive but entirely proactive, prepared for every possibility, every contingency. He did not need to announce his presence with noise or theatrics. The moment he entered the periphery of the scene, the smallest gestures became enough to unsettle the attackers. A shift in stance, a controlled gaze, a subtle tightening of his posture, all signaled that the balance of power was no longer theirs. In that instant, the predators began to sense something unfamiliar, something that challenged their assumptions and threatened the narrative they had relied upon. They were no longer in control. Their arrogance met a force they had not considered, a presence that would not allow their intentions to go unchallenged. Her awareness of him was immediate, a relief mingled with a sudden, cautious hope. She had been bracing herself for what could happen, for the worst that human cruelty could inflict, and yet here was someone who could tilt the scale, someone whose very presence carried authority and protection. It was not about brute force alone. It was about timing, skill, and the capacity to assert control in a situation where every second counted. She could feel the tension in her own body begin to shift, her fear met with a counterbalance of security, a sense that she was no longer entirely alone in facing what was coming. He assessed the room quickly, almost invisibly, noting every potential threat, every possible escape, every way the situation could spiral. His mind worked with a clarity that was both mechanical and instinctive, calculating, anticipating, and preparing. He did not underestimate the attackers, and he did not overestimate the odds. He simply read the situation as it was and positioned himself to act decisively, a silent guarantee that the night would not end in the way the predators had imagined. Every muscle, every reflex, every thought was tuned to the same objective: protect the vulnerable, confront the threat, and impose consequences on those who sought to exploit weakness. Even as the attackers remained focused on what they thought they controlled, they began to sense the shift. Something about him disturbed their certainty, challenged the narrative that had made them bold. They had counted on ignorance and passivity, and instead, they were faced with awareness, skill, and preparation. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible, but it was enough. The room itself seemed to contract under the weight of his presence, the space around him charged with an authority they could not match. Every move they had planned now had to contend with the unseen but unmistakable reality of someone who would not allow their cruelty to proceed unchecked. In those moments, the entire dynamic of the encounter transformed. What had been a tense, terrifying scenario of helplessness and predation became a situation of confrontation and imminent accountability. The Navy SEALs' intervention was not sudden violence. It was the assertion of control, the precise application of authority that made the predators realize, even before any action was taken, that their assumptions had failed, their confidence misplaced, and their intentions in jeopardy. The room had shifted, the stakes recalibrated, and the night, which had begun as an assault on innocence, was now poised on the edge of retribution and justice. The courage that night was not sudden, and it was not born of fantasy. It was quiet, deliberate, and shaped by the recognition that some moments demand action, no matter the fear that presses in from every side. The young woman felt it first as a spark, a fragile, defiant awareness that she could not let herself be completely consumed by terror. Every instinct she had honed over the years screamed at her to survive, to protect herself, to resist in whatever way she could. Courage, in its truest form, is never about recklessness. It is about clarity, about understanding the stakes, and choosing to confront them despite the fear that threatens to paralyze. The Navy SEAL, observing her, understood this instinct. He could see it in her eyes, in the subtle shift of her posture, in the way she drew herself up even as the threat loomed. Courage is recognizable. It is a language of the body, a code of the mind that speaks even when words are impossible. She was not screaming. She was not crying out. She was calculating, resisting mentally even if physically constrained. That mental resistance, that refusal to surrender entirely, was the foundation upon which the evening's events would pivot. Courage does not always roar. It often whispers, it observes, it waits for opportunity. The predators, on the other hand, had no comprehension of true courage. They assumed compliance, submission, a passive acquiescence to their will. Every step they took, every inch they closed in, was met not with obedience, but with quiet, simmering defiance. Their arrogance blinded them to the fact that courage is contagious. It draws strength from the presence of allies, from the unshakable awareness that some forces cannot be coerced or controlled. And when courage is paired with skill and experience, the kind embodied by the Navy SEAL, the dynamic transforms entirely. One act of bravery can ripple outward, reshaping the odds in ways that are both subtle and absolute. As he moved closer, the SEAL's presence amplified her courage. There was a symmetry in the room now, a balance forming between threat and protection. She realized she was no longer entirely alone. She had an unexpected ally who carried not only skill but the authority to confront the aggression that surrounded her. Courage, she felt, was no longer hers alone to bear. It was mirrored and reinforced in him. Together, awareness and experience created a tension that the attackers could not account for. They had assumed domination would be effortless, but courage, in its quiet, unyielding form, had already begun to destabilize their confidence. Every calculated step the SEAL took was a signal to the predators that their time was limited, that their certainty was about to be challenged. Courage is amplified by the perception of control, and control can intimidate even those who once assumed absolute power. The predators sensed it, though perhaps not consciously. They began to hesitate, their arrogance faltering under the invisible weight of accountability. Courage is often invisible until it is confronted directly, and yet it exerts pressure nonetheless. Every pause, every moment of awareness, every refusal to cower is a force that can disrupt plans and reorder power structures. She could feel the shift, subtle at first, a trembling in the room's energy, a loosening of the grip that fear had attempted to impose. Courage is transformative. It is both shield and sword, protecting the spirit while challenging those who would exploit weakness. The predator's intent, once so clear and domineering, now wavered under the combined weight of her defiance and the seal's presence. They had not anticipated that courage could be a weapon, that awareness coupled with support could unbalance even the most confident aggressors. Their calculations had failed because they had ignored the human factor, the unpredictable force of someone refusing to yield. Courage manifests in many ways, and in that room, it was both subtle and undeniable. It was in the way she held her gaze, refusing to look away despite the terror that threatened to consume her. It was in the way the seal positioned himself, silent but commanding, a living testament to preparedness and authority. It was in the small but critical movements, the mental strategies and physical awareness that maintained a fragile equilibrium until intervention could fully unfold. Every second was an exercise in endurance, in mental fortitude, in the quiet assertion that she would not be entirely defined by the threat she faced. Even as adrenaline surged, even as fear threatened to overtake rational thought, courage held its ground. It was neither loud nor theatrical, but precise, focused, and purposeful. Courage does not guarantee safety, and it does not erase the reality of danger, but it can shape outcomes, alter dynamics, and create openings where none seem to exist. In this case, it became the fulcrum upon which the balance of the night shifted. Courage was no longer abstract. It was tactical, practical, and deeply human. It was the thread connecting awareness, resistance, and eventual intervention, quietly ensuring that the predator's control was never complete. Consequences have a way of arriving when arrogance and cruelty collide, often in forms that the perpetrator never anticipates. That night, the predators had acted with an assumption that the world would bend to their desires, that no one would intervene, that they could act with impunity. Every step they had taken, every whisper, every encroachment, had been calculated in their favor. But the moment the Navy SEAL intervened, the scales began to tilt, and the inevitability of accountability became palpable. Consequences are rarely immediate in ordinary life, but in moments of extreme action, they arrive with sudden, unyielding clarity. The predators, once confident in their dominance, began to feel the first tremors of that reality. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible, a hesitation in their movements, a flicker of doubt in their eyes, but it was enough to disrupt the rhythm they had assumed was theirs. Arrogance is fragile when confronted with skill and moral authority. It crumbles under the pressure of someone who refuses to allow injustice to stand. The consequences that night were not only physical but psychological, striking at the very core of their presumption that they could act without accountability. Every step they had taken toward harm now seemed to recoil back on them, exposing their vulnerability in ways they had not foreseen. The Navy SEAL did not act out of anger or revenge. He acted out of precision, strategy, and a commitment to justice. That distinction mattered because consequences are most effective when they are deliberate rather than impulsive. The predator's behavior had created a scenario that demanded correction, and correction requires clarity, focus, and control. The moment was no longer theirs to dictate. It belonged to the force that had entered the space, reshaping it with authority and experience. Each motion, each calculated step, served as a reminder that actions have repercussions, that those who exploit weakness are never as untouchable as they believe. She watched as the predator's confidence began to unravel, as the consequences she had feared now became an instrument of justice. The weight of their actions pressed down on them, and every arrogant assumption cracked under the realization that their intentions would not succeed. Consequences are often sudden in moments like this because the imbalance created by cruelty cannot sustain itself when confronted with skill and resolve. They had assumed control, and in that assumption lay the very mechanism of their downfall. Every gesture they had intended as dominance became evidence of recklessness, a record of their hubris that the night would not forget. Even as tension filled the room, there was a rhythm to how consequences unfolded. It was not chaotic or vengeful. It was precise and measured, a series of actions designed to assert boundaries, restore order, and communicate an unmistakable truth. Exploitation has limits, and cruelty carries its price. The predators began to sense it, though perhaps not consciously. They felt the shift in power, the inevitability of accountability, and the consequences that would follow. There was no need for threats or words. The presence, strategy, and deliberate intervention communicated everything. Consequences, after all, are most impactful when they are unavoidable and undeniable. In the midst of fear, she could witness the transformation that consequences bring. They were no longer abstract ideas or warnings whispered in distant tales. They were real, immediate, and unstoppable. The predators were confronted not only by skill, but by the moral force that demanded responsibility. Every act they had committed, every intention to harm, now faced correction. The weight of consequences is heavy, and it settles unevenly, often crushing the arrogant while leaving those who acted in awareness intact. She felt relief, but also a sobering recognition. Consequences are impartial in their inevitability, striking where recklessness and cruelty intersect. Consequences are also instructive. They communicate truths that words cannot, truths about power, about morality, about the boundaries that exist even in the darkest moments. The predator's experience that night was a lesson written in stark clarity. Domination over another is never without repercussion, and presumption of impunity is a fragile shield. Every hesitation they felt, every falter in their movements, was a direct result of ignoring the consequences their actions would summon. It is in moments like these that the moral weight of intervention becomes most apparent. The predators are forced to confront not only the skills of those who challenge them, but the inevitability of their own choices. Even as events continued to unfold, the pattern was clear. Consequences are not abstract. They are immediate, tangible, and transformative. They recalibrate the power dynamic, exposing the weaknesses of arrogance and the strength of those who act with awareness and purpose. For the predators, it was a reckoning. For her, it was a demonstration that even in moments of extreme vulnerability, forces exist to restore balance. Consequences, precise and unavoidable, were now the reality, reshaping what had been a scene of fear into one of accountability. Transformation is rarely gentle, and it rarely announces itself with fanfare. It begins quietly, almost imperceptibly, in the spaces between fear and relief, in the moments where survival intersects with awareness. That night, after the confrontation and the intervention, she felt a shift deep within herself, a recognition that she had crossed a threshold, one that separated who she had been from who she would become. Transformation is not only about what the world does to you. It is about how you respond, how you internalize experience, and how you allow it to shape your sense of self. The girl who had walked into that night, cautious but innocent, was no longer the same. Something fundamental had changed. The events had stripped away layers of naivety, revealing a resilience she had not fully realized she possessed. There is a clarity that comes from surviving the unthinkable, a sharpened awareness that the world can be cruel, but that one's response can define the trajectory of life. She had faced fear in its rawest form, had confronted the threat of exploitation, and had witnessed justice administered not by chance, but by skill, courage, and intervention. In that crucible, innocence was lost, but so too was helplessness. Transformation carries with it the duality of loss and empowerment. What is taken away is often replaced by insight, strength, and a deeper understanding of personal boundaries. The Navy SEAL's intervention was more than physical protection. It was a catalyst for her own transformation. Courage, justice, and skill combined to create an environment where the predator's power was dismantled, and in that dismantling, she experienced a profound shift. Transformation often occurs when external forces intersect with internal fortitude. She realized that survival was not passive, that her awareness and resistance, however small, had contributed to the outcome. Empowerment emerges from the recognition that even in extreme vulnerability, one can influence the trajectory of events. The seal's actions amplified her own awareness, creating a synergy between external support and internal resolve that reshaped her identity in ways she could already feel taking root. Transformation also carries the weight of reflection. She could not simply forget what had happened. Memory is an indelible part of change. But reflection does not have to mean despair. It can mean understanding, learning, and reclaiming agency over one's life. She understood, with painful clarity, that she had entered a new phase of existence, one where caution would coexist with courage, where fear would be balanced by awareness, and where innocence, once lost, would be replaced by knowledge and vigilance. Transformation is never instantaneous, and it is rarely comfortable, but it leaves an imprint that guides decisions, instincts, and the way one navigates the world. In the aftermath, she could sense subtle shifts in her behavior and perception. The way she moved through the world, the way she assessed situations, the way she measured trust, all had been recalibrated by the events of that night. Transformation is as much about perception as it is about action. It shapes the lens through which life is interpreted. She understood the fragility of innocence, the necessity of awareness, and the value of having allies in moments of extreme risk. She recognized that her life could no longer be approached with the same casual assumption of safety, but she also recognized the depth of her own capacity to endure and respond. Her transformation was also about reclaiming power that had been threatened but never fully taken. There is a subtle yet profound shift that occurs when one realizes that vulnerability does not equate to helplessness. She had been confronted with the intent to dominate, to impose fear and control, yet she had emerged not only intact but stronger in her awareness and resilience. Transformation is about reclaiming what is yours, even when the world attempts to take it, about understanding that strength is not the absence of fear, but the ability to act despite it. That night, she reclaimed more than safety. She reclaimed her agency, her identity, and her sense of self-respect. The emotional resonance of transformation is equally powerful. Relief, gratitude, and empowerment intermingle with lingering fear and reflection. Transformation is not a single emotion. It is a spectrum of understanding that encompasses every reaction the experience evokes. She could feel the layers of fear receding, replaced by a cautious confidence, a sense that she had endured and survived a defining trial. Transformation leaves its mark not only on memory, but on instinct, decision-making, and the way one carries oneself forward. She felt that mark as a subtle, continuous presence, guiding her and reminding her that the events had changed her forever. Transformation is not merely survival, it is evolution. She had faced a night that tested every boundary of fear, courage, and morality, and in doing so, she had stepped into a new version of herself. The experience had altered her perception of danger, power, and resilience, and it had created a foundation upon which a new identity could emerge. The girl she had been was gone, but in her place stood someone defined by awareness, courage, and the ability to confront and endure even the darkest moments.